Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Sophie Scott-Brown. She's a research fellow at the University of St. Andrews and future fellow at Remarque Institute in New York. She is also founder of the Everyday Democracy Project with Open Society Foundation. And today we're talking about the history of European political thought, left-wing politics in Europe, anarchism, the Enlightenment and liberalism, and some other related topics. So, Sophie, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, let us start then with European political thought. So, you yourself, how far back do you go when studying the history of European political thought? Or when would you say perhaps it starts, or what are the parts you're most interested in?
Sure. Well, this is a really interesting question, obviously, because I stand with a foot in two camps. So I'm an intellectual historian, but I'm also a political philosopher. So, and I'm sure we're going to talk later a bit more about the conversation that happens between philosophy, politics, and history. Yeah. In terms of my sort of historical work, now, obviously, I was taught in at university in the sort of standard way. And generally speaking, you can't get very far in political philosophy without really ancient Greece. You can't really escape Plato and Aristotle, the kind of key founding texts that gave us so many of the very familiar normative ideas that we have about what politics is, how it should be done, who should be doing it, all that sort of thing. So obviously you could, if you wanted to do sort of European political thought, you could be very, very traditional and conventional, and you could start there. And that obviously gives you the foundations for a lot of ideas that get sort of altered and reiterated and regenerated over the generations. In terms of my own practice, however, I identify predominantly as a modern historian, and modern's one of these another wonderfully elastic words. So although I tend to focus on 20th century stuff, obviously I sort of follow the threads of that back into the 18th or the sort of Enlightenment period, and possibly slightly beyond to the things like the scientific revolution in the kind of late sort of 17th century type thing. You can do that, and the reason that you would do that is because actually a lot of modernity is a very different set of political and economic conditions, which obviously was very, very, very different from what they were talking about and having to comprehend in antiquity, and also in the Middle Ages, medieval periods. So you've got this wonderful mishmash of questions that have been asked over and over again for as long as people have been getting together talking about how to organize things. Then you've got a very specific set of conditions which we now know are the kind of architecture for what we call modernism, particularly in terms of economics and politics. So they follow through too. And then I suppose as a historian, you're busy weaving all these threads together, seeing how this set of conditions affect this kind of question. So when you do the 20th century, you can't do it in a vacuum, although, you have to bring some of that memory back with it, not necessarily because it is what happened, but it's actually more important what people believe about the past and how that motivates them to make the decisions they do in the present. However, having said all that, I'm now going to sort of flip it slightly, because the philosopher in me always looks at history with a little bit of skepticism, and says, well, actually, yes, it's very useful. What does history do for us? It gives us context, it gives us a sort of genesis, it gives us a story to feed into, to orientate ourselves with. But actually, history can do a lot else, can do a lot more for us too. As I said, the normal account of the history of political thought starts in ancient Greece. And when you do that, you automatically are talking about how to be a leader, how to have governments, how to have authority. Why authority is necessary, because it protects us from our worst instincts about ourselves, or why authority is good because it helps us be our best selves. Those are the two stories that come out of ancient times, really, and travel forward. Now, if you're an anarchist, that's not very helpful. If you're an anarchist looking for accounts of how in history we can show that actually authority isn't always necessary when it comes to organizing ourselves and splitting up our resources and making decisions about that. So you might start elsewhere in history. You might, as Peter Kropotkin did, the Russian scientist, he actually went back to prehistory. How did very, very early forms of human organization work themselves out? And his argument was that it's not just about competition and authority therefore being necessary to moderate competition. We can trace a history of human beings being cooperative, and that cooperation being what has helped them the most to develop and flourish as a species. There's been some updates to this. So in the mid 20th century, anthropologists got very excited about tribes, finding indigenous peoples who equally had no hierarchical structures within their cultures. They did have quite repressive, shall we say, customs or religions, but nevertheless, they did not have anything that you could equate to government. More recently, David Graeber and David Wengrow have also gone back into prehistory and found examples of groups or tribal groups that, again, didn't need government. So this is another perennial theme. Perhaps we shouldn't be looking at ancient Greece. Perhaps we should be looking much further and much more broadly. But the final thing I'd say is just, going back, putting my historian's hat back on. At any moment in time, it depends where you want to train your historian's eye. Now, if you want to do politics, it feels natural that you would look to governments, to kings, to leaders, to emperors, to presidents, to queens, whatever. But you could, if you were imaginative and inventive enough, look elsewhere, because even if people aren't calling themselves politicians and aren't calling what they're doing politics, if they're making decisions about how to live together and how to split up resources, then they are effectively being political one way or another. How they're managing a series or collection of vested interests. This could be in a purely trivial way, in a sort of in a village, in a family. So if you're the kind of historian that doesn't mind being a bit imaginative and a bit creative, you can find politics in any space, in any time, in any country, at any point. So to answer, to come back to your question, where do you start? Where do you want to?
Okay, so there's a lot there, but I will perhaps put a pin on the bit that you mentioned with that is more related to anthropology. I mean, Peter Kropotkin and then anthropology, and then you also mentioned David Graeber and others. So I will put a pin on that because later when we talk about the Enlightenment and Steven Pinker's take on it and stuff like that, I think that will make for a good segue into that. But before we get into left-wing and right-wing politics, let me just ask you one more broad question about what you mentioned there. So do you think that with the advent of modernism, the questions we are interested in asking in political science and political philosophy, it changed, or are they the same, but we have to answer them in a new set of circumstances?
That's a really good question. I think in some ways, so the question being is, so how much does that change of situation affect the way we think about politics? In some ways, very profoundly. Because if you're talking about inner antiquity, you're talking about cultures that, the degree to which you can assure and be assured of the continuation of life is obviously much more reduced than in modernity. Modernity is sort of defined by the extent, and it's a horrible phrase, but the extent to which there's been a conquest of nature, so that our lives are much less unpredictable. They're much more secure. We can be sure that we'll make it through the winter, that we can respond to illnesses and what have you. The further back you go, there's a precarity, there's a worry, there's a fear. Things like scarcity are on people's minds constantly. That changes the kind of arguments you can have about politics. Not entirely, because as we've been discussing, it doesn't mean that just because life's a bit more precarious, you're going to have to talk about authority, and cooperation's only something like you get with the luxury of not worrying. No, no, as Kropotkin was arguing, cooperation was a much more sensible strategy for managing scarcity and precarity.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that you discount one set of questions in favor of another, but certainly modernity does change things dramatically in terms of how we relate to one another. So the kind of questions that Plato and Aristotle were thinking about, we carry them with us because we're used to, because all of those sort of, if you think about all the great thinkers of modernity, all the great theorists, people like Karl Marx or Nietzsche or Hobbes or all of them would have studied the ancients, and so in some ways they are always organizing their thoughts around those ancient questions, even if sometimes that means they're not necessarily paying full attention to the modern facts. I think what I would really think is striking at this particular moment is the extent to which that process is really working against us right now. And actually the kind of questions we're asking, we're so used to a particular set of questions and a particular way of asking that we have ignored for too long some facts about what our modern situation, our late modern situation really is. For example, this is the great year of elections, right? Britain's just had one. It was the most thrilling non-event I think I've ever witnessed. France, bit more exciting, but still we're seeing some really interesting results. We're seeing people get quite excited about politics, like in France right now, very excited, a very dramatic result, and yet not a result, because ultimately people are saying, right, well, it's almost a defensive move. We need to keep the worst at bay, but we're not confident that any form of government's really going to get us to where we want to be right now. And right now, we are facing problems that the standard ways, the standard tools we have for dealing with things don't work anymore. No single national government is going to be able to respond and react to the kind of modern problems we've got. And by modern problems, I'm talking about, well, what happens when you have global pandemics? How do you join up? How do you coordinate? How do you respond to those effectively? Climate emergency, right? That's something else that you cannot just centralize in a national government. It doesn't make sense. It's not how it's going to work, and it's not how it's going to work in the future. So yeah, your question's bang on. Right now, we're too busy asking old questions, and we're not really paying enough attention to present realities.
So, but now, because I want to ask you about left-wing politics, what are the actual origins of the terms left-wing and right-wing?
Sure, I actually didn't know until you mentioned that this was an area you were looking at, and I'm still a bit hazy, but it seems to have actually been a fairly incidental kind of usage that originated from the French Assembly during the kind of revolution. So the right was sitting nearer, were those that supported the older regime or the older establishment, and the left were the ones that wanted, a bit more radical change, a bit quicker, and were sort of more allied to the revolutionary cause. And that seems to have been just a sort of kind of a sort of accidental thing that caught on, like these things do, sort of went viral, if you could go viral in the 18th century. What's interesting to me now is just, again, and it touches back to your previous question, these terms are so ubiquitous. They are really quite strong in our minds, and they carry very strong moral loadings as well. So it could be that, a lot of us will think automatically, oh, left are the goodies, right are the baddies. Or equally, we might think, if we're more inclined towards the right, the left are irresponsible, we, the right, are responsible. But there's strong sort of, again, like a real moral infusion in those ideas. And yet, how helpful are they? In some ways, what the anarchists have always done is respond to those terms because we have to, because they're there and they're very useful ways to help us organize our thoughts. But have actually said, well, you know what? Quite often, the anarchists have the same kind of problems with people on the left and as they do with people on the right. So one of the major criticisms against a figure like Marx, for example, was that he was very authoritarian, dressed up as a libertarian, but secretly very authoritarian. So in some ways, left and right, it came into use kind of accidentally. It stuck around. We're so used to organizing our political world by it. But is it actually very useful? Is it helping us right now? Or actually, are there other ways to look at the political landscape, like who wants more control and who wants to lose or give away more control?
And do you think it's helping us or not?
Left and right, I don't think it helps anymore. I think there might have been a moment where it was useful, but I think right now what's really interesting is actually looking underneath those two terms. Like I said, so I tend to be associated with the left, and I'm sure we'll come to that in more detail later. But I mean, for me, it's sort of I think right now it puts us in an unhelpfully polarized, tribalized position. I'm on this team, you're on that team. It's not really helping us discuss the common problems that we have to face. And it's not really allowing for there being quite significant lines of difference between people who might all agree, for example, on a more socially driven approach, as opposed to people who have a different approach and a different point of view. They're not fine lines, they're actually strong lines of difference between people who we would put on either camp. And if we don't recognize them, we reduce the amount of tools and resources we have to problem solve, because we just lump people together. And right now, we need as many different ideas as we can get.
And also, I don't know if you agree with this point, but it seems to me that there's enough evidence to say, at least in the US, but probably in other places, that if you ask just common people on the street whether they identify as Democrats or Republicans in the case of the US, they tend to agree more or less with the same social policies, just asking common people on the street. It's just that when we get into social media and sometimes even mainstream media more generally, and when we get into more intellectual debate, sometimes things get a little bit more polarized, or apparently more polarized, because it seems that common people just want more or less the same things: better health, better education, better salaries, stuff like that. So
these are social things. I mean, people actually, I mean, I think the political divides, I think you make an excellent point there. The political divides mean something to the politicians because they're the ones playing the game. But for most people, actually, we are now getting to a point where we don't have the luxury of, it's not like football. We're not picking our favorite side and, debating, the various strategies. I'll just get that in as the Euros are on. But right now, people have just, real serious issues just living. How are we going to live? How are we going to deal with the effects of the climate emergency? How are we going to deal with much more mobile shifting populations? How are we going to deal with cost of living? And, quite frankly, they don't care what those people are doing. And more to the point, because we've reached a stage with our political systems, bearing in mind the extent to which they are all still just reiterating very old models that were kind of formalized and organized in the sort of 19th century, and are now proving pretty inadequate to dealing with the kind of problems people are caring about. There's actually very little between them other than maybe style of presentation. So in Britain, for example, until about the early 19th century, so throughout the 18th century, you basically had the Whig Party. That was it, the Whigs, just the Whigs. And the only division was that you had some Whigs in power, and they were the court Whigs, and you had some Whigs out of power, and they were the country Whigs. And the job of the country Whigs was to keep the court ones honest, as it were. But basically, they were all pretty much on message, believed the same sort of things with tiny kind of nuances between them. We've actually gone far more back to that kind of system right now. That's possibly more relative, more to the point in Britain. I do think you're getting, in order to get difference, and this is maybe a more pertinent point for Europe, in order to get real difference from the centre ground, which seems to have gobbled up so much, you are having to really get massive polarization to the point of ludicrousness between the two parties. The reason we're seeing a hung situation in France is because it is actually not realistic that either the far right or the far left could run a government, because government by definition is that centrist ground.
So let me pick on something that you just mentioned earlier. You said, I'm not sure if you yourself would identify as a leftist, but you said that people usually place you on the left. So what does that mean for you exactly? And how would you characterize perhaps the left wing today? Or, what are the aspects of the left that you identify with yourself?
Sure. I don't think, I do still use the term, and I would probably position myself definitely more that way, although that ends up getting into trouble quite a lot, actually. So people assume that, I'm a good, fully paid up leftist person, so I get endless invitations to socialist this, or kind of this collective, that collective, and I've got a horrible, I have to confess to you, exclusive here, I'm not very clubbable, as the phrase goes. So I'm generally a bit wary when people say, would you like to join our collective? I'm like,
Yeah.
well, I'll think about that. But nevertheless, it is an important term for me, and I think it's because, quite often it comes down more, and I think this might segue into anarchism, because anarchism is just such a kind of radical rethinking, just in terms of how you organize and describe and discuss politics. It's been really helpful. That's how I got into it in the first place. It allowed me to express things that I wasn't finding the language for anywhere else, and that was really helpful. For me, the reason I suppose I would still identify with the left is because I do, like, if my primary drive or commitment is to liberty, and I do think that we get a better quality of liberty and a more security, of a better security for our liberty, if we can start from a basis of more or less sort of, not necessarily complete, equality, but from a decent level playing field where you don't get excessive extremes. So I suppose, to me, it's like, if you were just to go off and pursue liberty on that, in that sort of free market sense of each for their own and good luck to you, which isn't, entirely without merit as a political philosophical idea. But if you do that, it's always going to be a fairly crap kind of freedom, to put it bluntly, because if you're in a competitive situation, you'll always have one eye over your shoulder to see who's coming for you, and you will entirely define your freedom according to a set of status symbols or acquisitions that really are not designed to maximize anybody's freedom. They're maximized, they're designed to ensure that a few people have a lot of ability to do a lot of things, and a lot of people have very little ability to do very much. So I suppose that's my reason for favoring the social side. Plus, I just think actually it's so much more creative and fun and more interesting, honestly, to have more people standing sort of eye to eye, shoulder to shoulder, no kind of artificial divisions or barriers between them, and actually challenging ourselves to see what it is to live with people without kind of having to resort to sort of imaginary barriers for why we shouldn't take someone more seriously or as seriously as we take ourselves. So I just think it would lead to a more interesting life, frankly.
So let's talk now then about anarchism, because I think that probably there are many common misconceptions that people have about anarchism, and many times they equate anarchism to chaos, basically, right? So what would you say are the main tenets of anarchism? And since you mentioned liberty there, do you think that liberty is also part of it? And if so, how does it manifest specifically in anarchism?
Sure. Again, great question. Anarchism itself, that's quite simple. The word is, I mean, first words don't have to be last words, but generally speaking, it's quite useful just to go back to, well, what does that word actually mean? What is this word? Because anarchists, you won't be surprised to hear, are very anarchic. So each of them will be an anarchist in their very own special way. What on earth can bring anyone together around a collective term? Well, this notion anarchism, which is basically absence of permanent authority. Now that's it. That's kind of all it starts by. That's all it's committing you to. Which okay. That's actually enough. That's quite a massive philosophy in and of itself. All right, because it opens up so many other questions. So you mentioned liberty. In some ways, I think that position in and of itself, just that rejection of any sort of permanent authority. And I deliberately use the word permanent because there are plenty of forms of anarchism which might accept temporary forms of leadership, just nothing that becomes institutionalized or permanent. Others are far more puritanical about that, but let's just keep flexible for now. If you're not going to have any sort of permanent authority, then that kind of automatically puts you in a position of strong non-interference, which we would all be familiar from those of us who studied kind of normative political theory. That's the negative definition of liberty. Sort of the idea that, what we're looking for is a position that maximizes individual freedoms. And that's the kind of fun thing about anarchism for me. So I think liberty, so we've got lack of permanent authority. So therefore, this question of a strong or a maximum amount of liberty, let's say individual liberty, is present. So from that's it. That's all that you're kind of, that's all you have to sign up for in order to be an anarchist, if you like. Now, where it gets really fun is the fact, really fun, but really complicated, is that after that, the kind of positive program, what are you going to do with your liberty? What does it look like? How does it feel to you? Do you even want to decide that at all? Do you have ideas about how everyone can get this liberty, or do you think that's not really up to you to solve? You only need to fight for, you fight for one individual's liberty and that's enough. The positive program, like what you're going to do with it, that is really massively open to interpretation. One of the things anarchism's criticized for, but I think you can equally see it as a great strength, so it's simultaneously both, is the fact that it does splinter off into so many different subcategories. I mean, you only had to go on Wikipedia for 10 minutes. And there's anarcho-socialists, there's narco-feminists, there's narco-ecologists, and then that's just layer one. That's just your second order anarchism, right? You can have third, fourth, fifth, because you can have, well, I'm an anarcho-feminist, radical, socialist, but only on Wednesday, because on Thursday I'm with the individualists, and you can do that. It's you can have so much fun trying to work out what kind of an anarchist you are today, that you actually never get around to doing anything, which is the criticism. But nevertheless, I think on a very baseline, you as an anarchist would always stand up and resist the idea of any of the further encroachment of any form of permanent authority on your life. So that's what will bring us all together at a rally. Not much else, just that.
Okay, but with that in mind, let me ask you then, do you think that anarchism allows for any form at all of hierarchy, even if it's just, let's say, a fluid or informal hierarchy, if it's not someone on the top imposing necessarily things on other people or even restricting their liberty in any particular way, but just, let's say, to orient society, to organize society, something like that?
I'll talk for the kind of anarchism I defend, because I know that plenty of sort of people who identify with anarchist ideas would answer this this quite differently. I mean, just to give you a flavor of it, I mean, there would be some that would say, no, you can actually approach society in a way where you never have to have any sort of leadership. I mean, the sort of very, very purist anarcho-communist position, for example, would say you could structurally design society in a way that nobody would ever assume positions of leadership or authority. Now, my response to that, because I'm not an anarcho-communist, as we mentioned, not so fond of joining things, but so my response to that will be, okay, but someone has still had to take the authority to decide what that, completely egalitarian design looks like. Someone's then got to impose it. And even if in the long run, we'd all love it and it would be perfect and we'd all be so much happier, we might not in the short term. And that's always a means and an ends question that is important in anarchism. Like, can you ever force people to be free? I think the answer, the anarchist answer for me is no, you can't. So yes, you can have forms of anarchism which would completely sort of reject any form of authority, leadership, etc. I think actually it's not incompatible with anarchy to say that there are sometimes actually there are people who are just because I would also rather work with people than structures or systems. My anarchism is about taking people seriously. And if there's a moment where there are people certain groups of people, certain individuals who are clearly much better suited to lead on something, maybe they know more about it, maybe they're more confident, maybe it's familiar to them, whatever the reason. My problem would be if that then became permanent and institutionalized. That to me is a problem, because that would mean that at some points you will have issues that those people are not the best suited to deal with. And yet they would deal with it at the expense of others who were more confident, more knowledgeable, etc. So I think my version of anarchism says anarchism is, that absence of permanent authority should mean that you're able to negotiate and invent or create the right response to the situation you find yourself in, and not just gonna continually have to defer to a structure or to a form of leadership that isn't going away, regardless of whether it's right for right now or not. So yeah, that does lead me into some tricky ones. I mean, for example, with the green issue right now, a lot of people feel that the only way we would get quick enough along the road to solve our problems, do the things that we are being advised we need to do to keep at 1.5 or not exceed that too excessively, that many people feel, right, well, we're just going to need a kind of green dictatorship for a while, that we're just going to have to force these measures on people. I'd say no, that's not what I'm talking about. I do understand why people would feel that, you need to have more force at some time than others. What I would say is right now, we do need to be giving far more prominence and far more platforms to people who really understand what's going on environmentally, ecologically, how that intersects with our lives, our, the economy, our general way of living society. So it might be that those people shouldn't always be in the spotlight forever and ever more, but they need to be right now.
No, one of the reasons why I asked you that question, I think you would be open to this kind of evidence, let's say, because I've talked with many anthropologists on the show and sometimes about these particular questions, is that, for example, even in more traditional societies like hunter-gatherers, for example, and the more egalitarian ones, it seems that even if you don't want to call them necessarily leaders, there's always a few figures that have at least more authority than most of the other people there. I mean, in egalitarian societies, of course, they are egalitarian in terms of resource distribution, let's say, and also in terms of everyone there being able to have a voice and participating in decision making, but still there are always a few figures there, like, I don't know, perhaps the best hunter, the shaman, and people like that, who in particular areas have more authority, and they also sometimes even participate in conflict resolution. Like, for example, if there's a conflict between two people, they step in to try to solve it. They say, okay, so stop it, let's talk, let's try to solve this according to our norms here and stuff like that. So I mean, what I'm trying to say with this is that I'm not completely close to the possibility of we having a society with no authority and no leadership at all, but it's just that even in those more egalitarian traditional societies, I don't think that there's any of those societies out there where you can't find any sort of authority or leadership at all.
I think you're right, and there are sort of two ideas that what you've just said has sort of reminded me of, or sparked in me. I think, firstly, what I'm really interested in is that authority which is so responsive to the moment. I think a lot of my problem, and I think, again, this goes back to our issue with antiquity and why philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, they seemed to always want to, well, not Aristotle, actually. He's a different, we'll bracket Aristotle for now. Plato, certainly, there's a timelessness about Plato, wanting to transcend the moment, the kind of messy, right, what's happening right now in the present, always looking outward, you know, to this sort of universal, timeless perfection. And you know, that's the instinct to strive towards it. Actually, what you're describing about with the kind of sort of egalitarian type tribes, or even non-egalitarian, whether they would see themselves that way, who knows? But it's that complete attention to the present, and people being able to command a certain amount of, you might call it authority, you might just call it sort of compelling presence, or perhaps certain people resonate more at different times than others because they are so responsive to the moment. And I think we've been so busy trying to pursue, and maybe and political science does this an awful lot, you know, in terms of trying to kind of, if we get this perfect theory of how power works and how to do it, we can almost uncouple ourselves from context, from time and place. And I feel that whenever you try and make power or authority permanent, what you're basically trying to do is outrun the world, outrun time and space. And you can't. And that's what makes it toxic. That's what makes it a problem. So actually, there's no problem at all for me having sort of people who emerge and they say things that click. They might not, it's not necessarily about they have the answers to our questions, but they give us tools that allow us to do things that get us closer to feeling more comfortable, safer, you know, and that can be a wonderful thing if they are truly, sincerely, you know, sort of true experts and have true understanding, or have true compassion. Maybe that's the correct word. But it can also, you know, because we're so desperate, because we are so desperate for those voices who are actually listening to our problems and responding back to them, that actually we're finding people who have not got the full compassion, the full understanding, but who are going through the motions of responding to people's wishes. And that's, well, basically, I'm talking about the rise of right-wing populism here. It's very easy for those, and again, we're back to our left and right here, but it's very easy for those on the broader left, shall we say, to be horrified and mystified by the rise of right-wing politics across Europe, across the world, and say, how is this happening? How is this happening? Does this mean that apart from this small relative minority of intellectual elites, that actually everyone's just a sort of closet fascist waiting to break out? No, it doesn't. It means that what those people on the right, whether it's totally cynical and strategic, or whether actually it comes from some kind of genuine attempt to identify with very human fears and insecurities, what they're doing is they're saying, your politics isn't listening. We're listening. we're listening and we're going to respond to what you're frightened about. They're not going to do it in an open-minded, compassionate, way, particularly. They're going to do it for their own gain, but nevertheless, it's something they're doing that maybe the other side, the other big political players are not doing. But returning to your to the issue about so that just sort of maybe addresses that kind of lingering danger of demagoguery, which is always available when you're talking about any kind of sort of spontaneous or charismatic approaches to leadership. Nevertheless, so leaders who speak to the moment, I think, are important and useful, provided that what they say to that moment is genuinely going to get us closer to where we want to be, rather than seem to do that, but actually take us further away. The other thing is just rethinking what we mean by leadership anyway. Sometimes leadership is what you're saying when you mention people who do mediation or who facilitate conversations. That's actually a really interesting variety of leadership. It's much more interesting, ironically, much more sort of enthusiasm for it in the private sector and in business. Where, okay, you get used to having the big sort of dragons and what have you who go out there and clinch the deal. But actually what most corporations rely on is the sort of as much sort of collective or group intelligence as possible. And that person who can tap into that and unlock it and unleash it becomes the more valuable leader than the one simply barking instructions. So different types of leadership, and leadership that's responsive to time and place.
Yeah, I mean, what I was trying to highlight with that is that usually in conflict resolution, for example, people have to respect the person who steps in, and if they respect him or her, it's because he knows more, he has more status, something like that. Or otherwise, I mean, it's just an exact equal. And so I don't know if it works, but the other thing I would like to mention as well is that, for example, in those kinds of egalitarian traditional societies, even if there's a best hunter, for example, he might catch the big animal, but then he comes back to the tribe and he has to share it, to share the meat with the other people, at least to some extent. And also another thing that I'm not sure at all if it would work in bigger scale societies, but if the people who are considered the authorities or the leaders start or become bullies, for example, and start mistreating other people, then they basically get put down, and sometimes in extreme ways, like if things get really messy, they might even get killed. So I mean, that's perhaps another way of more direct.
The lesser known part of anarchism, you get to kill the bad leaders. But no, it's interesting you say that, and you sort of make and it's an important distinction there. You know, again, anarchists have this habit of looking back to these prehistorical times or digging up this tribe that used to live by love alone and all that sort of thing. And we were like, well, that's nice. However, we live in an incredibly economically and politically complex society. I actually think one interesting way to look at that is that, again, we've talked about how things change, evolution, history of things, and the kind of late modern moment that we're at the moment. There would have been a point, 19th century, early 20th, early to about the mid 20th century, where the state of kind of modern organization, economically, politically, socially, was such that you're quite right. You know, the very notion that you'd head back to the village or whatever was patently ridiculous. And the only sort of use it served was to show that once, and in some situations, it is quite possible that you would have social orders driven by cooperation. Actually, now we've almost come back full circle. We are, you know, things have become so big and so globalized and so unwieldy that it could actually be the one moment where a kind of neo or remixed or reduxed, if you will, sort of version of those kind of societies becomes much more plausible, because actually the idea that these central control spaces like the nation state are falling down, they're not granular enough. these problems that we're facing are universal, but they're also incredibly localized. So suddenly, I think we're back at a point. And it's interesting, the first thing that the new Labour government have done on taking power in Britain is say we need to talk far more about devolution. This idea that actually you could go back to more federated models where actually people are living and doing things on quite small scale, you know, but always part of wider networks and all that sort of thing. Maybe we're actually at a point where a new or revised version of that's more plausible than it would have been 100 years ago.
So I would like to ask you now, and perhaps this will also make a segue into the last topic I want to address here today, having to do with the Enlightenment and liberalism. How, because you sort of have a foot in each of these camps, how do you look at the relationship between history and politics?
Oh, that's a very good question. I will try not to ramble too much. So obviously, obviously, I'm going to say that there's a very strong reciprocal relationship. In fact, there are many, many kinds of relationship. I think history is incredibly important to my thinking through of politics, and always has been, for some of the reasons that we've touched upon. For me, it was impossible to think of politics in quite the vacuum, in quite the entirely theorized or philosophical way. It always felt slightly wrong, frankly. That it was just missing too much information. So I think why history became so important to me, why I kept going back to it, because I kept trying to escape as I was sort of studying and what have you. I sort of my first instinct was philosophy, and then I sort of, okay, well, that's kind of missing some of the power play there, so I better shift towards politics. I did a stint in the anthropology corridor. Honestly, in my undergraduate degree, I worked my way up and down the humanities corridor before I finally chose a degree. But I kept coming back to history, because in some ways history allowed me to do all of those things. It allowed me to look at how people negotiate the interplay of their vested interests, which is how I define politics. It allowed me to look at how people conceptualize the world and how they then choose to take actions on the basis of that philosophy. How people sort of live together, whether or not they're intending or planning it, that's anthropology. History let me do all that, but it allowed me to do something extra, which was situate this all in context. Now, again, it's sort of interesting, the historicism debates, and this is a big feature of European philosophy, like Hegel, Marx, people like that, that actually, you know, kind of once we get the knack of how history is unfolding, you know, then we can align our lives to that, and actually we'll all be the better off for going in the right direction, as it were. That kind of history politics relationships never made any sense for me. I am one of the one thing after another school of thought. Lots of little connections, no inevitability about it. And context has always been really important to me, because it actually shows how, even when we think things look very continuous, the devil's in the details. Actually, the small shifts that we have to make in order to accommodate the problems that we're encountering in the here and now make all the difference. And therefore it seems so odd to me to just study the history, like so many history to this day, political philosophy textbooks will plod you through this history of ideas, completely denuded of the sort of rich kind of comings and goings and toings and froings that were shaping all these thinkers and their thoughts. And when you put those back in, again, we've discussed how some terminology like left and right gets a little bit loose, a bit slippery when you're really up close to it. And that's possibly most of the joy for me. So, I mean, I draw the very self-serving conclusion that if you study history and politics in conjunction, you can only be an anarchist, because it shows that taking too hard or firm a position on anything, and not recognizing the sort of very many different possibilities that might have come about, the different kind of scenarios that we could equally have easily found ourselves living in, the what ifs, the maybes, you know, all that's really rich and really exciting. it goes very much against a culture that's constantly looking for certainty and solidity. And that's something I think, we need to maybe address about ourselves. Why does our craving for certainty actually leave us facing a more catastrophic uncertainty than if we just embrace the fact we cannot know and control everything all of the time? Looking at it the other way, though, of course, history is always a political intervention of, whatever you try and claim about it, whatever aspirations you have for objectivity as a historian. And to me, that's absolutely fine and just as exciting to do, provided you just acknowledge that frankly. Now, in the sphere of politics, history's been used shamelessly, left and right, continually. I've got to say, the right seem to do it better in terms of they're able to produce very compelling mythical histories, like histories of this is who we are as a people. We are we, they are them, that there's sort of a very handy technique. The left's always been, to its sort of to its credit, but also to its disservice, it's always been a little bit maybe more discerning about who the thems and us's are. It's never quite managed to provide the same equally compelling myth of the people, although we've seen interesting examples like in Stalinist Russia or Stalinist Soviet Union, I should say, where you do see similar type attempts to manufacture these, or the invention of a tradition, the invention of a sort of people and their identity. I think when you sort of put yourself through that professional training all that really means, when you are a sort of professional historian, as I am, what that really means is that you sort of cultivate your skepticism, as it were. That's essentially when you do it, sort of when that's what you are training yourself to do. So actually, I had a professor quite early on in my career tell me, well, you'll know when you're a real historian when no matter what the issue is, you come down very firmly on the fence every time. But even that is a political intervention, because what that's asking us to do is wait and diffuse for a moment. And actually, that is still a political stance. It's a political move to make. And again, it's sort of maybe heading back to what you were saying about that sort of leadership that mediates as well as advances. It's saying, wait, let's look around us. Let's take a moment, to kind of see the lay of the land and not make too many quick decisions that are too limited in terms of their understanding.
Okay, so for the last topic, then let me ask you, what is your take on Steven Pinker's take on the Enlightenment, liberalism, and his narrative of progressivism? And perhaps at some point we might insert here or go back to what I put a pin on earlier that had to do with Kropotkin and Graeber and the anthropologists. But give us perhaps a first answer to that.
Sure. Well, I don't know if you know this, but actually the pleasure of mediating, I mediated an interview, refereed, not sure what you call it, with Steven Pinker not long ago, and he was facing an adversary from political science who was as you might expect, challenging him on his claim that actually, since the Enlightenment project was a good project and actually far from sort of collapsing, deflating, falling on its backside, we have continued to advance. Progress is not just a myth, it's something we can quantifiably say about ourselves. And I was in the position of chair, so I had to keep my mouth zipped whilst he was saying what I consider to be quite provocative things. But yeah, so on reflection, so Steven Pinker, I think actually there's a lot to admire about his argument, mostly because I just love anyone who's antinomian enough to kind of upset what's become a kind of popular truism, right? Steven was working during the sort of a period of times of 80s, 90s into the 2000s, that's the sort of early part of his career, when that it was the most fashionable thing to do in the academy was laugh and dismiss and sneer at the progress myth, and how those poor deluded Victorians had thought this ridiculous thing, and obviously this completely ignored slavery, completely ignored racial inequality, completely ignored sexual inequality and sexuality inequality, and basically it was progressive for a teeny tiny handful of white middle class Protestant, well, in the sort of Anglo sense, men.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was quite refreshing for him to go, well, hang on a minute, no, wait. It's very easy to bash modernity and modern life, and very kind of seductive to look back, because it wasn't just the left that were doing it, the right were, of course. So we had the kind of nostalgia industry ramped up in the 1980s, and don't you remember when it was all lovely and the squire was at his gate and the peasants were in the garden and it was all very jolly? Never happened, but wasn't it lovely when it did? So there's a boldness in that argument, and it's asking us to actually kind of, all right, it might not feel great now, but what do facts tell us? How might we arrange this? And I think he does make some valuable and valid points. His sort of idea that so by progress, I think we ought to qualify, he's talking as much about kind of intellectual moral progress, not just the fact that we can cook things faster, or we can propel ourselves across distance fast. These are forms of progress, but they're not really, they don't change much. It takes a handful of activities that humans like doing and just does them bigger, faster, and more, which is not unhelpful, but it's not, I suppose, if you want progress in terms of genuine change, irreversible change towards having more options, more possibilities, more ideas about who we are, how we could live, etc. So that's the kind of progress that he's got, partly in mind, I think. And, I think one of the key points he makes is it is true that we generally live in less violent cultures. It may not feel like it. And I think certainly during the interview that I did with him, he was willing to concede, well, okay, I do think progress had been made, was being made. But I think we might have to sort of reevaluate that now, not necessarily abandon it, but reevaluate that, because maybe one of the criticisms you could make of his idea was, well, what exactly do you mean when you say there's less violence? Maybe actually, okay, we're not in the Middle Ages where the torture was routine, public executions were normal, domestic violence was standard practice, even amongst so-called, kind of in so-called liberal households, children, animals, whoever, they were totally expendable. And we don't have that now. We do spend a lot more time in certain places, sort of talking about it, disputing it, questioning it, challenging it. We do that more. Doesn't mean we've eradicated it, but that sort of general casual acceptance that life's violent and you're going to get exposed to violence at some point. I think he's right to say there has been a shift on that. But on the other hand, maybe violence just has this wonderful ability to keep changing shape, doesn't it? So isn't it a form of violence when we just let continue with behaviors that will inevitably result in a worsening climate emergency? I mean, this is the basis of so many of the lawsuits that we're seeing. Young people saying, well, it's an act of, anticipatory violence. So we might be far more controlled in our behaviors on the surface, again, in some places. I mean, I don't think if I went into Gaza today and said, guess what, everyone, there's much less violence than there ever was before, I'm not sure too many people will be coming with me on that one. Similar, I could say similar going into, other places that have experienced horrendous conflict recently, Syria, Ukraine, obviously, Myanmar right now, that's a sort of live battleground that we're not hearing sufficient about, really.
By the way, on that point on violence, let me just add, because a couple of years ago I had on the show Philip Dwyer, who is a historian from Australia, and he
Yes,
wrote a book titled The Darker Angels of Our Nature that was a
yes,
response to Steven Pinker's take on
yes.
violence. And he has very good points on that book. Of course, I can't reproduce all of them here, but a few are like that we still have slavery, and there's an argument to be made that not in terms of percentage, but in terms of raw numbers, perhaps we have more people enslaved nowadays than we had even when slavery was legal. And then he also points to how the internet facilitates certain types of violence, like,
Yeah,
for example, sex trafficking.
yeah.
So, I mean, those are just two examples, but uh, I guess that Steven Pinker doesn't, I mean, doesn't consider that those examples and others enough, or doesn't take
Well,
them seriously enough. I'm not sure.
I mean, I do think that it's a serious flaw in the argument. If you're going to claim an
Mhm.
overall, which he is, an overall quantitative reduction, proportionally speaking,
Yeah.
in the amount of violence. So the raw numbers thing, I think he would contest by saying, well, you got to look at it proportionally.
Mm.
I also think that, you know, his argument would be, well, yes, but the very fact we're sitting here condemning the fact that, and I think the figure is round about 45 million people still in what you would consider a state of slavery
Mhm.
today, many of them women and children, through, as you mentioned, the sex trafficking and what have you. Again, I think he'd say, well, that was going on in the past too, but we were much less concerned. No one was concerned. It wasn't a problem. You weren't having a moral conversation about slavery, you know, 500 years ago, like you are now. Now, as a historian, I'm not that to me feels too linear. I think that we have this wonderful sense that it's to me it's a fall, it's a fall and ascent narrative. So we fell from Eden and then we've been gradually clawing our way back up, and it's a very standard way of narrating history. I think again it's this wonderful ability we have to say, oh well, like the argument that no one was an individual until modernity. Um, and then we all became individuals and we had states of mind and feelings and all that sort of thing. It's not true. I mean, people who lived in very close tribal, you know, kind of communities, that doesn't mean they had absolutely no sense of being, you know, or knowing when they'd been hurt or when they'd been betrayed or when they'd been lied to, even if they didn't necessarily consider themselves a self and do lots of self-therapy or self-care or whatever. So I think it's really dangerous to do anything along the lines of saying, you know, talking about what people were or weren't aware of. I
And
do.
but by the way, on that point as well, because particularly in Enlightenment now, the subtitle I think is something like "Reason, Science, Progress." I mean, the idea that I'm not sure if he's exactly making that argument, but but it sounds like as if reason and science appeared in the Enlightenment, and before that
Yes,
there was
yes. I
basically
think
no
that's,
reason
yeah.
and basically no science. And that's completely untrue, because I mean, in terms of the science, at the very least, you have to admit that in the Muslim world during the European Dark Ages or Middle Ages, at the very least, you had proto-science there, and they were doing something
Oh, you
similar
had
to science. And
incredibly
I mean, and
educated.
the reason part for me is just if he is making that argument, it's just silly.
No, you're completely right. I suppose what he's doing, and it brings us right back actually very neatly to our kind of opening conversations. And again, this notion of, well, what do we mean by anarchism and you
Yeah.
know, kind of the sort of where do you start in history question. So it all sort of comes
Mhm.
together in a beautiful symphony. I think what he's saying really is that what the Enlightenment does, I mean, it's a formalization, it's an organization process. So suddenly, off the back of that, you can sort of trace things like, well, where do we find the roots of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? So I
Yeah.
suppose if you're looking at ways where certain ideas, certain practices, certain values, intellectual, moral, etc., got formalized into sort of what we would now call kind of any sort of globalized legislation, insofar as that is ever effective. We have seen very dramatically the limits of things like the International Criminal Court to deal with problems like Ukraine, with problems like what's happening in Gaza right now. However, you know, I suppose what he's saying is, I would say his progress narrative has behind it a thinking of global legislative practice now, which may be that he says, well, there could have been people doing brilliant things, but that didn't turn into a rule book for the human race. And I'd say, well, okay, I would accept that differentiation. I'd still question, I think that in terms of, you know, that argument that I'd still question how universal that rule book is, how effective it is. But you can't deny that it does exist, and it came into existence at a time when that sort of our globalized nature of our life was becoming more formalized from that point on. Again, not to say that people weren't traveling, weren't encountering each other, weren't doing interesting things. But I don't think that's clear. I mean, I'm sort of interpreting, possibly too heavily, who knows? And I think you're right. I think that we have suffered from a serious lack of being more curious about the histories that lie outside of the history, capital H sort of thing. And so I think there's a salutary lesson for all political scientists out there. Go back to the past, but look laterally.
I mean, at the very least, I think there's a strong argument to be made that perhaps the sort of way he presents history in his books, in The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment now, is very Eurocentrist.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good argument to be made. But then let me just run perhaps 2 or 3 criticisms that I have about his work through you to see what you think about them. So I mean, first of all, I respect him a lot as a cognitive scientist, as a psychologist, as a linguist. But nowadays, after spending years talking with political scientists, historians, and anthropologists, trying to address each of the points that he makes across his books, which are a ton of them because he covers a lot of ground. And so it's very, very hard to evaluate all of what he says there. But I don't think, I no longer take his, let's say, takes on political science and economics and anthropology seriously at all. So, but another, the 3 points I was going to make are, the first one, I think that he is very dismissive of people who were actually part of the Enlightenment, but just because they had ideas that he doesn't like, he says they were not really part of the Enlightenment. Like, for example, Nietzsche. Oh, he was a romantic and an irrationalist, so he was not really part of the Enlightenment. Marx. Oh, because the Enlightenment has to be capitalist. He was a communist or a socialist, or socialism and communism not part of the Enlightenment. And then perhaps people with other kinds of political thoughts, other political thinkers that would be perhaps more or less in favor of progressivism, more conservative or something like that, maybe he would put them aside as well. But at the very least, Nietzsche, Marx, and some other people like that, is extremely critical of them in their books. And I guess that if you would ask him directly, he would say that they were not real enlightened people or something like that. And then, I mean, another point is, oh my God, I lost my train of thought now. But I mean, perhaps respond to that one, and then I will
I'll
try
respond to that whilst you sort of work on the other points. So I think you're absolutely right. Again, we talked about this earlier, or my sort of sense that history is always a political intervention. I do think there's a strong element of that in what Stephen Pink is trying to do. I think it's more of a rescue job for a particular version of the Enlightenment that led to a kind of liberal world order, which he sees as the most sort of sensible, as liberals tend to do in their liberal way. It's the most sensible, it's most reasonable, it's the least bad of all the options if you must have leadership. Because it's amazing how many liberals will grudgingly sort of, kind of shuffle their feet, look and say, well, yeah, law, government, it sucks, but it's necessary and it's sensible. So I think you're completely right. The Enlightenment, actually, we tend to reduce it down to this, here are all the bits that we most recognize and are most useful for us right now. And of course, it just wasn't like that. I mean, if you want to say anything about the Enlightenment at all, it was a large outpouring of ideas about how things worked, how the world worked. Nietzsche, I mean, like the relationship, the Romanticism is really interesting. It's always positioned, again, as opposed to the Enlightenment. I would say it was fully a part of it, because a romantic thinkers, no less than the rationalists, had a theory about how the world worked, and on the basis of that theory, how you could then operate within it. Now, their theory was there isn't a one big truth we can know. We're always inventing that truth. Someone like Nietzsche says, fine, well, if we're going to invent that truth, let's really invent that truth. Let's not dilly-dally. Let's not wring our hands. Let's not be apologetic. Let's invent the world then. And in some ways, Nietzsche does not lead in a straight line to fascism. He was simply making a kind of philosophical argument. Well, if the world is so much, to an extent, a projection of our imagination that we convince or compel people into believing, then what would that look like if we actually acted like that? It's a thought experiment.
Yeah. Okay, so the two other points that just came to my mind is the first one, I think that he doesn't take seriously enough critiques of capitalism. So I think that he dismisses too easily, takes from socialists, takes from communists, and I mean, whatever, I wouldn't say whatever, but many of the criticisms that people would have to make about capitalism and about things like even economic inequality and its effects, I don't think that he takes it seriously enough. And perhaps partly related to that point, and also something that you mentioned briefly earlier, I mean, at a certain point, it gets a bit weird to me when people say that, okay, so we have this problem, we have violence, for example, in that particular kind of way, and then most of the time his response is, okay, we have that, but in the past we had more. And it seems that he's always making that kind of argument, and at a certain point I'm no longer sure if he is just saying that or if he's just outright dismissing the point that people are making, because if that's something that still exists, it's still a problem. But sometimes I'm no longer sure if he even considers it really a problem, just because we have apparently lower levels of it now than we did in the past. So
so the first point is that he doesn't take seriously the critiques of capitalism.
Yes.
I mean, I think my answer to both would be, I find reading Stephen's work, and like you, like I said, I enjoy many aspects of the boldness of the argument, full stop. I'm glad it exists, if you will. However, and obviously full respect for his scientific work, and also always in the spirit of history being a political intervention of some kind or another. I find reading Stephen's work a kind of wonderful mixture of idealism and really hardcore realism. And maybe that's partly what's at play here. So I think there's this quite idealistic view that a lot of those sentiments in the Enlightenment, and this notion that you would make decisions based on rationality, that you would organize affairs according to pre-planning informed by, a factual understanding of the situation at hand. All these are sort of are not unreasonable things to sort of to believe or to want to see. And I think a lot of it sort of, a lot of his motivation is worrying, perhaps more than he'd like to admit, that some of those things, just as values, not necessarily as realities, but some of those things as values are under threat. I think there's a real realist in Stephen too, in the sense that he says, well, I'm not going to talk to you about communism or anything like that. I think we have to deal with capitalism because that's what we've got. And actually capitalism, sort of well managed, sort of polite capitalism, the kind of Adam Smith style capitalism, which never actually existed because it's never the sort of Adam Smith account of capitalism, or, you know, sort of free market, I should say, or free trade, never takes into account the fact that you're never starting from a position of free trade. You always are starting from a position of, your second point, you know, massively powerful vested interests who are going to skew that competition. So we're never going to get to this situation where we are genuinely in a free competition. That's an actual historical time and place, right here, right now problem that no amount of Enlightenment theorizing has really dealt with. That, you know, and I suppose what you're saying is actually there's a wonderful sense of, we can all be very excited about the promise of the Enlightenment, but what it never really did was confront the fact of power, which doesn't always yield to reason or rationality by definition, but it's nevertheless a fact, and it's nevertheless an active fact. You don't need to be a wild intellectual to see what power unchecked does. And intellectuals can sometimes actually be so enamored of these sort of clever ways round problems that they realize that actually, no, sometimes you do have to give an answer to the brute force question. Namely, power is not going to go away because you show it all how unreasonable it is. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas, right? No matter how well you make the case. So I think there's an element of that which does, I agree with you, severely undermine the overall project, that we've come this way just by sheer sort of small steps, gradualism, reasonable advance. And the gradualism, I think, is the other aspect, which is why you don't get satisfying answers to your question of, but inequality still exists if we can prove that it's not rational to do this for the human race, and we can prove it's perfectly reasonable to rearrange resources so that it's no longer necessary, why do we still have it? And then Stephen saying, yes, but we have much proportionally less of it, even if in raw numbers we actually have more.
And it's not just that we still have it, but even more that it tends to be very dismissive of the social, political, and other kinds of effects that economic inequality has across different societies. I mean, at a certain point in Enlightenment now, it seems that he just brings up studies about how apparently if people perceive, even if it's a very, very, very high levels of economic inequality as fair, it doesn't matter. And I mean, for me, that doesn't make any sense, because economic inequality has social and political effects, regardless of people looking at it as being more or less fair. So.
No, it's a good point. And again, I think it's this sort of, actually, there's a very humanistic element in his thinking, in the sense that if the empirical person, if you will, the person you ask says, oh no, I don't feel things are unfair. And even though you're looking at the stats and comparing them with what they could be, going, are you sure? You know, that's I think I would give credibility to taking that person and their feelings seriously, but not exclusively. So you're right to say that people and how they feel about situations, if they don't feel that they're living a horrible life, then frankly, thank God, you know, sort of that's a mercy, because I don't want anyone to, you know, we don't want anyone to be sitting there feeling like that. But at the same time, you know, there's a line between that and having your head in the sand over things. So it's that sort of push-pull between trying to respect how people feel and where they're at, and then that sort of very gently trying to kind of change things. And again, remember, it's always a kind of act of authority for anyone to say, well, you might feel that way, but I can assure you it's not like that. the best, you know, and I think, again, that's what someone like Steven Pinker would be trying to avoid, that if you're going to change things, you need to bring people with you, even if that slows down your journey. So I think he tends to avoid, not necessarily because their reasoning is incorrect, but in terms of whether it's, I mean, he's a brilliant psychologist. So there'd be a degree to which he's like, well, how do people change their minds about things? How do you make people want things, even when they don't realize they want them? If you point to those people who are talking about extreme differences, which would be massive upheaval, people tend to not buy into that as much as if you say, well, let's start small. What kind of, all right, you're generally happy, but is there anything you've noticed in your life which is upsetting you or rankling you? So start from there, and that's your departure point. Which doesn't actually mean, and again, this is maybe why those history books he does are generally for large, popular public audiences. They're not the kind of technical books or technical monographs or articles that he would produce as a scientist. So there's always a degree of which he's saying there's a case to be made that the Enlightenment didn't fail, and you know that we should still buy into its values. And that in the process of making that argument, I think what he's also trying to do is say, well, let's save those values because actually they're under threat right now. And in order to do that, I'm going to tell you 90% of what you think you already know, and then just a small enough twist to make you kind of come with me on this. That would be totally my guess. But I did used to teach rhetoric, so possibly I'm just putting a rhetorical spin on this, which doesn't exist. Who knows?
So I was looking at the time. Do you have just a couple more minutes to reply to the last point I made, which I can repeat if you want?
Yes,
Or
sure.
okay.
Yeah.
So the last point was basically me saying that I think I'm not sure at a certain point if he takes seriously the fact that certain kinds of issues like violence of different kinds still exist, because he's always going back to the argument that, oh, but before the levels were higher. In ancient times, the levels were higher because, and something that he keeps repeating is that it seems to him that the progressives do not like progress. But I don't think that just because someone is pointing out a problem that we still have, regardless of it being at lower or higher levels than before, that they are dismissing progressivism, or they don't like progressivism, or they just want to be negative. They're just pointing out a problem that still exists. And sometimes, I don't know, it seems to me that he's too dismissive of people pointing out those problems, because it seems that he takes it as being an attack to the kind of argument he presents in his book. So,
well, I think the thing with progressives is that I mean, I think actually I'd agree with him to a point and then disagree at a point. If you're a progressive, your job by definition is to be that awkward person who wants to move things forward. And that's genuinely your job. And you wouldn't be doing it right if you just went, oh yes, pat on our backs. We've all done excellently, jolly good, feet up, everyone. Right. So there is an extent to which this is kind of a necessary friction to have. And actually he's almost doing the progressive cause a favor by pushing back at it a bit, because if you want to kind of propel things forward, you know, sort of you know that you sort of you're kind of saying things aren't good enough as they are. So, you know, it is a sort of creative friction, I think, to kind of have that argument. I think this comes back to his notion of gradualism. And again, I would say it's sort of like the progressives, almost you have a license to almost go too far. You do by definition need to be a little bit utopian in your aspirations, like this isn't good enough, we can do better, we should. And that's a driving force. It drives people forward. And then you can have a sort of second flank of people saying, oh well, you know, let's calm down, let's not go too fast, all that sort of thing. And I suppose the change that you're wanting to happen lands in between, you know. So the progressives are almost pushing further, you know, it's the leverage theory of persuasion, right? If I have a really crazy goal, a really out there goal, I need to use a lot more force to get a tiny bit of movement. Because I suppose the implication there may be, Stephen suspects, as William James did, that sort of social psychology, if you like, William James used to call it the ancient mass, and that the best you can hope for as a progressive is you stain the ancient mass, just a drop, and like a drop, it gradually infuses, very gradually, until you can slightly change the chemistry of that ancient mass. And I wonder if a similar idea is at play here. So I don't think it's a good enough argument really to say, oh, but there's proportionally less. It's not a great argument. It's a true one, but it's maybe not. It's maybe allowing other people to be aspirational and taking the position of someone who's being, quote unquote, a realist, with the hope that that conversation between our wildest dreams of our best versions of ourselves and what we've got at the moment, something in between those two poles or axes, may be the direction we can shift ourselves gradually towards.
Yeah, just to give a quick example of something I heard from him that illustrates what I was trying to convey earlier. I mean, I watched a video of him in a Q&A, and I'm not sure what the question was exactly, but at a certain point he said something like, oh, people who are part of progressive movements, even if they become obsolete, they have to invent new problems to stay relevant. And they gave the example of feminism in the most developed countries. And I was like, really? If feminist is obsolete by now? It seems a bit silly to me.
Yeah, again, it's a confronting position for him to take, but it's almost again, it's almost, I'm not sure I'll say that was deliberate provocation. It might be nice to think that it was. But I think there's a sense to which what Stephen Pinker represents is an attempt to say, you know, it's attempt to it's kind of a conservative position that's not traditionally conservative. It's almost an attempt to kind of reclaim conservatism towards something that actually progressives still aren't going to agree with, but they could work with far better. So instead of a fictional the people and the organic community, he's saying, look, through reason and time and being gradual and patience, you know, we've done a darn good job, thank you. And it is our job, people like you and me, to say it's not enough for us.
Yeah. So let's perhaps end on that point, because we're already going over time here. So Sophie, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Oh, well, I mean, so I have several books which are available through a number of book retailers. In fact, my first book is Open Access with the Australian National University Press. That is all about the history of history and different ways you can use history as a sort of political tool. And that's the Histories of Raphael Samuel, Portrait of a People's Historian. I have a book on the art of everyday anarchy, and you can find that through various bookshops or ideally through libraries, particularly college libraries. My next book is coming out with Oxford University Press, probably beginning of next year, and that's looking at activist politics during the Cold War. And then I have a book about a new philosophy of liberty that will be forthcoming in early 2025. You can also find some videos of me talking about anarchism, various kinds, forms, varieties, and they can all be found via the Institute of Art and Ideas channel or found on YouTube.
Great. So I will be leaving some links to that in the description. And Sophie, thank you very much again for the conversation. It was very informative and fascinating. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbourd, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.